My mom's words that evening scared me to the death to the point where I couldn't sleep. My parents fell asleep on the couch, meaning that I wouldn't risk sneaking into my room and possibly getting caught. I got approximately 2 hours of quality sleep behind the couch that night. My teeth were constantly clattering, and the only sound I could hear was my racing heart, blocking out any sounds that could have possibly occurred within the dark house. I was surprised that my parents didn't wake up. My short, blurry dreams felt like they were from hell. I kept dreaming about Mr. Franklin killing me, or dying how Joshua died. Actually, how did he die? I don't know, and I don't think I ever will. Maybe if I get to see him in heaven, or the hell that Mr. Franklin created. I couldn't believe that Mayor Xavier was dead. Who would replace him, and more importantly, who would want to be the mayor with all these imposing threats? Unless somebody had the mindset that they were indomitable, nobody would want to be the mayor. All I could do was wait for school that night. I was fear-struck the whole night. It reminded me of teenagers' romance struck and not being able to sleep the whole night. But in my case, it was the complete opposite. Hatred burning in my soul. Hun, my mom shrieked at the top of her lungs, waking me up from my light sleep. It's 6 a.m. We need to wake Leo up. My heart, which finally began to beat at a normal rate, sped up again. If they found out I was behind the couch the whole night, they'd be mortified and probably ground me for longer than they already have grounded me. Head up to his room and wake him up. He probably fell asleep an hour or two ago, so try hard to wake him up. My dad groggily snored in a probably half-asleep phase. I heard the sound of the couch springs lift as my mom got up and began treading upstairs to my room. This is when I began sweating. Heard my mom open my bedroom door and yell, "Leo!" I emerged from behind the couch and ran upstairs. My bedroom door was swung open and my mom was searching around in the room carefully. I slid into the room and collapsed into a sleeping position on the floor. "Leo," my mom yelled one more time. I heard her footsteps come close to me before stopping. I opened my eyes slowly, beginning to speak afterward. "Yeah," I stuttered, managing to imitate a groggy voice. "Get up, it's 6 a.m., she snapped at me. I felt so relieved that she thought I was in my room all night. I stuttered okay as I began to stand up. My mom gave me a puzzled look as I began to stand up. "Why were you laying on the floor last night?" She asked as her face became more puzzled and my heart nearly skipped a beat as I realized she was now questioning the situation. I rubbed my eyes, still trying to imitate a groggy state. "I don't know, I fell off my bed last night," I replied in a clearer voice, signaling to my mom that really I've been up this whole time. "Well, did you hear the news?" my mom continued questioning, her puzzled look fading into a face holding back tears. I immediately thought back to Mayor Xavier. During the time I was trying to sneak into my room and pretend sleeping, I completely forgot about the homicide. "What's the news?" I asked as I pretended to act dumb. My mom began bawling in front of me. "The mayor was killed!" she shrieked through sobs. Even though I had heard the news, I had heard the news already. I had already heard the news. I began to feel something crumbling inside of me like the first time I heard the news. "The mayor was killed?" I asked as I continued acting dumb. "Like Mayor Xavier was killed." My mom nodded. She was so overwhelmed with negative emotions that she refused to speak. Her body language gave off the message, "Get ready for school now and we'll talk about this later." I left my room and immediately headed to the bathroom to get myself cleaned up for a bad day at school. Depressingly, I stumbled into my advisory class expecting a horrible day at school. The atmosphere seemed more monochrome rather than colorful, pessimistic rather than optimistic. Everybody at school seemed down today. When I was walking through the bustling hallways this morning into my class, there wasn't as much talking as there normally would be. Don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of socializing, but not as much as there normally would be. "Hello, class," Mrs. West said as she slowly walked to the front of the class. She was wearing a black hoodie and seemed down today like everybody else in the room. I'm sure you've all heard the news, but if you haven't yet," Mrs. West paused before finishing. Tears were leaking from her eyes. Her face seemed stained in salty tears. "The mayor has been confirmed dead." About a quarter of the class gasped in shock. Much of the class didn't gasp, but rather stayed silent as we all had to hear the news another time. Heard several girls in the back of the class quietly sobbing, but there was another sound I could never expect in the state of the situation. Laughing. No, not a normal, joyful laugh, rather a devious, hateful laugh. A laughing only the Clyde killers would do after finding out about the murder of Mayor Xavier. "Excuse me, ma'am." I raised my hand as the laughing got louder. "May I use the restroom?" Mrs. West silently nodded her head. I leaped out of my seat in a heartbeat and dashed to the door. "David!" Mrs. West yelled. "Why are you leaving so soon?" My hand landed on the door handle of the classroom door. I shot my head back and began to feel every part of my body go numb. "What do you mean?" I stuttered as I cracked the door open a bit more. Mrs. West gave a dubious look in my direction. The sobbing, the silence as the laughing became louder. Everybody could hear that it was coming from below the floorboards. I already knew that it was coming from below us, though, far before anybody else did. "Mrs. West," a short, dirty blonde student asked as Mrs. West squatted down to listen closer to the sound getting increasingly louder from below us. What in the world could be below us? Mrs. West stayed silent. Matter of fact, nobody answered the innocent boy's question. I rushed to sit back down at my desk as Mrs. West continued to listen in on the commotion happening downstairs. I moved my hand through the storage compartment of my desk and soon pulled my hand out, a crumpled ball of paper in my hand now. I uncrumpled the paper before standing up and dashing out of the class while Mrs. West concentrated on the sounds below. As the huge door slammed behind me, I heard the yell of Mrs. West. I heard the voice of Mrs. West shouting at the top of her lungs, "Who left the class?" I dashed down the empty hallways, forgetting about the advisory class. I took a look at the paper that I managed to sneak into my desk storage compartment. It shows all the entryways down to the basement, the meeting spots where Nathan would be hanging out, and the times listed at each of them. One of the entryways was in the boys' restroom in the last stall down. Nathan said that he would be here on Monday to discuss some news, like he already knew about Mayor Xavier's homicide before anybody else did. When I swung the door open to the restroom, I rushed into the last stall door that was wide open. I stood on the toilet and crouched to catch my breath. I looked around everywhere while catching my breath and couldn't find an entryway to the basement. Did Nathan lie to me? No, he couldn't have lied. I really did think that Nathan could have lied, however. He can't read the future. Nobody can. The laughing was much louder inside the bathroom compared to inside the classroom, and that's a detail I could now notice. This time I could hear not just laughing, but also music. Joyful vintage music. "What the heck?" I whispered to myself. As the air conditioner kicked on in the bathroom, disturbing the eerie silence, one of the roof panels slid off and landed on the floor in the next stall over. Now I could see where the entrance to the basement was. I jumped up and grabbed one of the roof panels to pull myself up to the crawl space that was above me. I noticed a lot of roof panels next to the opening once I caught myself on the ledge of this creepy space, managing to relax my body before proceeding further into the crawl space. After catching my breath for the second time in a row, I was ready to proceed further into the crawl space, but stopped once I heard the familiar sound of a song my parents had listened to long ago, "Paper Doll" by the Mills Brothers. The music was being played loudly, masking the sound of shouting perfectly. I began to crawl through the tight space, eventually ending up at a ladder, dust piling on every inch of my body. I grabbed one bar of the ladder, making a loud metallic sound as my grip strengthened on the bar before crawling forward and allowing my legs to dangle below me. I began to descend down the ladder, eventually reaching the terminus and setting one foot on the cold basement floor. Then two. Then I turned around and listened in on a conversation I could faintly hear. "The mayor is dead. The mayor is dead," a girl sang at the top of her lungs. "The mayor is dead," another girl shouted through the basement. Oh God. Once I stepped on that basement floor, I knew I'd most likely made the biggest mistake of my life, besides escaping the cafeteria at Greenfield Middle School that one night. Why was everybody celebrating Mayor Xavier's death? I began to slowly navigate through the pitch-black hallway I was now in. The only light I had was the faint flickers of an almost burnt-out light bulb. Burnt-out light bulb was emitting. It smelled like a dead, rotting animal down here. "The mayor is dead, and Leo is next," the teenager shouted through the lifeless corridor I was standing in. I stopped dead in my tracks right as those words transferred to my brain, accidentally making my last step echo loudly. As I stopped in fear, I heard the sound of footsteps coming closer to me from across the humdrum corridor. I slid out of sight, nearly crashing into a stack of boxes. I scrambled to find a hiding spot, still inside the corridor but completely hidden from view. "Anyone down here?" the same teenager yelled about 10 feet from me. "I heard a footstep, so come out wherever you are. You know I'm Anthony, and I'll kill you once I see a glimpse of you." "Anthony!" I couldn't believe it. This was the kid Nathan mentioned, and the kid he also claimed to be the worst person in this group. I caught my breath to keep the silence of the corridor. A drip of water was the only response Anthony received. Oh, so you want to play this game? I'll have you dead once I find you, and that won't take very long. I noticed a bright light flash through the corridor as I heard the deafening sound of a knife being sharpened. The flash of light turned out to be the flashlight. It illuminated the whole place, revealing a wrecked brick wall and broken water pipes on the ceiling. In response, I pulled my hoodie up to cover my head so I wouldn't be found hiding in my hiding spot, tightening my body into a small ball behind the boxes. If anybody is down here, come out wherever you are, Anthony yelled in a frightening voice. As he swung the flashlight around, I noticed that there were bloody markings and large holes in the walls that were masked in black from the environment. Killer, Gabriel, Mayor Xavier's puny wrists were slit. I was absolutely abhorred at the sight of those words. God, Anthony muttered after continuously swinging the flashlight around. Forget about this scumbag. This crap gets me pissed off. The flashlight Anthony was holding fell onto the ground, the light facing downwards into the cement floor. After triple checking that Anthony left the corridor, I slowly emerged from my hiding spot, first reaching for the flashlight. I clicked the flashlight's power off button and turned around back to the ladder with the flashlight off. I had noticed that the way I was going was heading closer to where a large chunk of the commotion was happening. I began to tread down the emptier, quieter, and quite possibly more risky part of the corridor. This portion of the corridor I was treading down was much colder than the other side I was in. I heard the bell from upstairs ring and the stomping of many students above me subsequently afterward. After the sound of the bell, I turned on the flashlight. And began speed walking down the seemingly empty, endless corridor. I looked around the corridor and realized why it was cold, dark, and empty, but also realized how this was a perfect spot for teenagers to canoodle. As I was walking past the many boxes and containers, I saw a couple behind one of the large boxes. I didn't have much time to notice them, and I'm glad I didn't. I sprinted past them and soon ended up in the large, empty corridor that trisected the corridor I was in. It's as if this basement is endless, but I know it isn't. As I was thinking to myself in the dark, I realized that I completely forgot why I was down here. I wanted to head down here because I needed to investigate the laughter going on beneath the floorboards in Mrs. West's class, but also because I was planning on meeting Nathan. I now had a somewhat good idea as to why the laughing was occurring, but at the same time, Nathan was never down here like I thought he was, and though I didn't realize it then, I was in my most vulnerable position yet. A homicide attack had been placed on me from this group, and I was lurking as a fraud in their territory. I didn't realize how close I was to possibly dying in those moments. I gotta get out of here, I whispered to myself. I began to run, keeping my steps quiet to avoid any unwanted clues as to where I was. Once I ran far enough down this large hallway, I began to recognize these corridors. Though it was a continuum, I felt as if I finally found my way out. Not out of the honey I slid into, however. Leo, a female voice shouted through the basement. The faint echoes following the shouting gave me a clue as to where the exit of the basement was, but also who was standing at the exit. My mom. I began to run to the dull exit of the basement, eventually spotting the figure of my mom appear as I reached the first step of the short stairwell. I continued climbing up the stairs until my mom could finally spot me. Leo, my mom quietly shouted at me. What in the world are you doing down in the basement? I gave her a puzzled look. What are you doing at the school right now? I calmly asked. What I'm doing, my mom replied, her face showing emotion similar to startlement and astonishment. Well, actually, forget about it. Leo, the police are here for you and will arrest you if you don't comply with their orders. I opened my mouth as my heart was in my throat. The police are here for me? What did I do? I was in complete disbelief as I began to walk past my mom and into the left-wing corridor. Standing across the hallway were two police officers, now rushing towards me. My mom wasn't lying this time, and why would she? She's a very honest person. Officers, stop! I yelled at the quickly approaching officers as I began to whine like a baby. Stop! I did nothing wrong. The officers completely ignored my whines and began to detain me, not saying a single word. I did nothing wrong, I pleaded with the officers to no avail. The ear-shattering click of the metal handcuffs now tying my hands behind my back made me really realize how serious this situation was. I did nothing wrong, but the officers didn't listen to my pleas once, and before I knew it, I was in the back of a police car with my mom. A disappointed look was worn on my mom's face. I knew she was beyond disappointed in me.